In this podcast, students will be able to describe the origins and motives of the Englishmen who founded Virginia, identify the reasons for the Chesapeake's embrace of tobacco and slave labor, and compare and contrast the New England and Virginia colonies. You should take notes during this podcast, pause as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you will need the notes to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. Unlike New England, Virginia, some 1,000 miles to the south, enjoys short winters and a long growing season. Nevertheless, it does not possess the mineral wealth that its original settlers had hoped to find. The Englishmen who joined Captain John Smith on his voyage had heard of the gold and silver that Spain had been mining since the 16th century in its colonies of New Spain, what is today Mexico, and Peru. Hoping to strike it equally rich in Virginia, Smith's band of aristocrats was sorely disappointed when they arrived in Jamestown in 1607. Unlike the hard-working middle-class Puritans who founded New England, the men who founded Jamestown were the second and third-born sons of wealthy landowners back in England. However, primogeniture, the practice of giving only firstborn sons land after the owner's death, meant that younger male heirs were forced to find fortune in some other way. Those who ventured to Virginia hoped to strike it rich and return to England to live a life similar to the one they'd lived as wealthy children. Unfortunately, the absence of gold and silver in the Chesapeake, the name for the region of Virginia and Maryland collectively, and so called for the river and bay that bears its name, meant that wealth would need to be found or produced in another way. Luckily for the Jamestown colonists, that opportunity arrived in 1612 when John Rolfe, who would go on to marry Pocahontas, daughter of the local chief Powhatan, introduced a strain of tobacco sweeter than the native variety. The flat, fertile land of the Chesapeake was quickly devoted to growing what King James I called that noxious weed. In the process, the Anglican settlers found their source of wealth, but they also encountered conflict with the Native Americans who used this land to grow corn and for hunting. The cultivation of tobacco is labor-intensive. Careful watch needs to be kept over the leaves to keep them free of pests. In the early days of tobacco cultivation, from the 1620s through the 1670s, this labor was carried out mainly by white indentured servants from England. Lacking the resources to get to the New World on their own, impoverished English men, women, and children would contract their services for anywhere from 4 to 14 years. In return for their labor, indentured servants would receive passage to America and food and shelter while they were under contract. The indenture contracts would often contain provisions for what the servants would receive upon the fulfillment of their term, such as a barrel of corn or a suit of clothes and even acres of land. However, the unhealthy conditions of the Chesapeake before 1680 meant that most servants, like many landowners, died before the completion of their terms. Therefore, before 1680, indentured servants remained the much more economical choice for landowners seeking labor. If both types of laborers would perish within 5 or 10 years after arrival in the Chesapeake, buying a slave from Africa for 4 times the cost of an English servant did not make smart financial sense. However, once the sanitary conditions of the Chesapeake improved around 1680, landowners increasingly turned to African slaves as the labor of choice. The first slaves from Africa arrived in Virginia in 1619 on board a Dutch trading vessel. Up through about the 1660s, English indentured servants and African slaves worked side by side in the tobacco fields and were treated roughly the same by their masters. When treatment was poor, as it often was, slaves and servants would sometimes run away together. Occasionally, black slaves and white servants would intermarry. During the first half-century of settlement, conversion to Christianity would even procure freedom for a slave. However, political instability and the financial move toward slaves over servants meant that Virginia lawmakers soon adopted statutes that made having black skin a liability. Historians have long argued over which came first, racism or slavery. In other words, were Africans chosen as slaves because Europeans had long viewed them as inferior? Or did Europeans come to see Africans as inferior only after they enslaved them? While we cannot answer that question here, it is clear that the first decades of Virginia's history did not evidence institutionalized racism. It was only around 1660 that Virginian legislators began to distinguish between blacks and whites in law. For example, Englishmen could not be whipped naked in public, but African slaves could. Soon, the provision allowing for manumission, or the freeing of a slave, after his or her adoption of Christianity was also forbidden. Unlike slavery in most ancient societies and in Africa itself, New World slavery was also inherited. Children born to mothers who were slaves would also become slaves themselves. This practice fostered the unholy rape of slave women by masters, whose mixed-race offspring were at once their property as slaves and their children. By 1680, Virginia had transformed from a society with slaves to a slave society, in which the entire legal, social, political, and economic structure depended on and supported the institution of slavery. While the majority of Southerners did not own slaves or own just 1 or 2, those wealthy planters who did often owned hundreds of Africans and African Americans to support the cultivation of tobacco and the lavish lifestyle it permitted them during the 17th and 18th centuries. While slavery existed in New England, colonies in the North were never slave societies. The climate and topography did not support plantation agriculture, where the majority of slaves in the South lived out their lives and worked. Most New Englanders owned small farms or businesses in which every member of their immediate family played an integral part. while African slaves did serve as domestic servants as well as skilled craftspeople in urban centers. Slaves accounted for only 10% of the population of Boston, New England's largest city. In conclusion, colonial Virginia adopted a path distinct from that of its northern neighbor. Jamestown, Virginia's first settlement, was founded by sons of Anglican aristocrats hoping to find or make easy wealth and return to the landed estates of their youth. Instead, tobacco cultivation allowed them to recreate that life in the Chesapeake, with one glaring exception. The genteel life that the planters had created for themselves by 1700 depended on the enslavement of Africans and the development of a racial caste system unknown in England or even in New England. Eventually, the distinctions bred between slave societies in the South and a North that would outlaw slavery by the early 1800s would culminate in the bloodiest conflict America has ever known, the Civil War.